All right, so I have my Lunar black. I'm going to start with some of the darkest areas first. I have a wash of Lunar black. It's not a very dense color. And with the other nostril. And then now I'm going to start from the bottom. Most of dog noses have this little crease running down the middle of the nose. That's the darkest. I usually come in and I add a micron pen at the very end in order to highlight that. And then now along the bottom of the nose here, we do have some of the darker colors, so I'm going to fill that in. I am going to keep this line a little bit more sharp. These lines underneath, I'm going to keep a little bit more sharp. Now, as we work our way up, I'm going to start using this stippling technique. So I'm going to come on up the side. I'm going to take a little bit of pigment off, come underneath my nose here, to the side. I don't want a lot of pigment here, but there is quite a bit of color. Grab a little bit more pigment. Now the marker that's underneath, if you can see, is helping us a lot in the areas that we need pigment and areas that we want less pigment. All right, now I'm gonna do the same on the other side before I get to the top. And notice that there's kind of a brighter highlight there. I might try to keep that highlight. Notice that where we have the purple pen, it's naturally darker for us, so we don't have to work as hard to place the pigment. Kind of connects here. All right, and now I'm ready for this stippling technique at the top. So I'm going to get a wash of Lunar black, quite a bit of paint on my brush, and now I'm going to start dotting with the pigment. There's certain areas that I'm going to, like this area here, that I'm going to brush throughout. That has, I'll show that area to you on the reference photo when I'm done. The rest of it though, I'm going to be stippling. I'm going to come all the way to the nostril here. And there are some darker stippling here in the front, coming around, dotting, and using some brush strokes closer to the nostril. And now on my reference photo, I can see that there's a little bit more strict of a line here. So I'm gonna line and then dot on top to lay my pigment down. Come along to the side. Don't worry if your nostrils don't have as much pigment there as you'd like. We can always add, we'll be adding more pigment later. And then there's always usually around the edge of the nostril. It's not actually on the nose itself, but we do have a shadow to the side here. All right, now I'm gonna come in while it's still wet with a darker lunar black. I'm gonna add another layer to my nostrils so that I can see where the nostril is. I'm going to add another darkness to this crease down the middle. Now, even though it looks like in the photo that nostrils have a sharp line to them, if you look close enough, they actually don't. So that's why I'm working more with wet on wet. And then I can always go back in and make lines sharper if need be. All right, now I'm going to let that go. As I let that go, I'm going to, now I told you I was gonna do the blue here and I forgot to do that first. So I'm gonna let the whole nose, what I just did, dry before I put that blue and before I work on the darker part on top. So as I'm letting that dry, I'm gonna actually work on this part below. I'm gonna use the same technique as I did on the nose, where I'm using this dotting stippling technique. And in my reference photo, and in all dogs that I've painted so far, it's darker here where it's immediately under the lip, and then as you move out, it gets lighter. And some of these dots here where we have the hair follicles, those are we're gonna keep those intact. Some of the other ones, some of them up here, we're going to blend a little bit more, but some of these dots on the outside we're going to keep intact. The lip here is important. My lip is going to be lighter on this underside, and the darkest black that we're going to do is actually going to be on the lip. So our line is going to be underneath, not on top. So if you notice with my marker, I did leave this thin opening here. So as I'm dotting, I'm going to be coming close to the edge of the lip. I might touch it in a few places, but I'm not going to create a sharp line here. My sharp line is going to be underneath. All right, here we go. So I'm going to take some Lunar Black. I'm going to start dotting underneath, and I'm going to add more pigment on the underside, or closest to the lip, or closest to the nose under here. All right, then as I move out, with our German Shepherd, we do have, it is mainly black under here. I'm gonna move out. Make sure you have quite a bit of water. And once again, I get close to the bottom of the lip. I do touch the bottom sometimes here, but I'm not doing a strict line yet. Coming back. And I'm noticing where the darker areas are, and I'm just dotting a little bit more pigment there. Up here, I notice it's a little bit more uniform color, so I'm going to actually use brush strokes for that up here. And now I'm going to come through with a little bit more pigment. So there's a lot darker of a pigment here, a lot darker coming through in the top. There's some darker pigment here. Now my all white areas, I don't want that big of white dots. So I do want to leave some of them though. Now there's a lot darker of pigment under the nose here. And there's some darker pigments here that I'm just going to add in some drops. These darker dots here are mimicking the hair follicles, where the hair follicles are coming out of the dog's mouth here. And the nose, even though it is a separate entity, it is coming, the color is coming directly up to the nose. So now that we've done this side here, now I'm going to do the other side. Before I do that, I noticed that this line is a little too strong. All right, now I'm ready for the right side. Same technique, lots of water. Now for this side, there's actually a darker bit of hair here. Then it gets immediately lighter, so I'm gonna stipple that lighter. And then it gets darker again to the center. The nice thing too about this technique is that if you get a little too much water somewhere, if it gets a little too dark, I clean the brush, dry it a little bit, and pull a little of the pigment. You notice that I got it a little too dark here. Now I'm gonna go back with some darker on the outside. And on the outside here, I'm going to take a dry brush, or not a dry brush, sorry, a clean brush. And I'm going to blend a little bit out. And I'm gonna go back with a little darker. All right, so that is how I use the stippling effect for the mouth area, just under the nose. I think this nose area is dry, so I'm gonna go back in, and I told you I was going to use a blue, a phthalo blue. I'm gonna use a really light wash for this. And this is coming just here. That's going to be the only portion of phthalo blue that I'm using. All right, and while this phthalo blue is drying, I'm going to start on the mouth area. So for the mouth, I'm going to use the same technique as I just used on the nose, and underneath the nose, I'm going to use this stippling dotting effect, and then dropping in more color, more pigment where it's needed. Now I already have, this is really important, I already have the white down for the teeth. Make sure that you do this for the teeth and for the areas where there are highlights. Otherwise, with this wet on wet technique, it's going to make those highlights disappear. I'm gonna do around the tongue first. You could do the tongue and the color that you'd like first, but I've just gotten used to doing around the mouth. So let's start. I'm using a lighter color first. And the nice thing then about having this watercolor marker already down is that it helps me to see exactly where my darker areas are when I put down this lighter wash. So it's pretty much uniform. The only highlights are the ones that I already had with the teeth. Down here though, we do have a few highlights right here. I'm gonna come onto the actual fur here. Now I'm gonna use a clean brush that still has water on here to blend out my lines a little bit. I'm gonna keep it wet. I'm gonna try to keep it wet so that I don't get a very strong line. Now I'm gonna go in with some of my darker Lunar black, add in, dropping the color where it needs to go. Noticing that the color is a lot darker inside the mouth than it is on the outside. And since it is wet on wet, it's gonna give me this these lines that are not as strong as if I were to do wet on dry. As we come up to the teeth, the areas in between the teeth are a little darker. I'm gonna drop in some pink after this. This area is a lot darker. Going to go back by the fur and with a clean wet brush, I'm going to blend out and even this spot I noticed is where I had a darker spot here. notice that this is a little too light now for the rest of the values. All right, and if you notice, I mean, I do have a lot of the purple shining through. For me, that's totally okay. That's why I'm using the purple undertones. I'm gonna come on in and I'm going to drop a little bit of my Quinacridone Magenta. That's going to act like the pink of the mouth. And I can just drop it on top of my Lunar Black as long as I don't have too much water. You'll notice that if you have too much water as you're dropping this color in, it'll displace the black. Just coming in, adding a little bit more Lunar Black. And that's it for this side until I let it dry and see what needs to be changed. So I'm gonna move on to the other side. Same technique. All right, so I finished on this right side. I did add a line of black here before I started the tongue and shade it out. You can do the color of the tongue first if you'd like, or you can do the black first, whatever is your preference. Now I'm gonna let this dry. As I'm letting this dry, I'm going to work on the final part of the nose here, doing the same techniques as we've done on the rest of our dog. So we're going to lay down a layer first of color and then drop in some darker black. And I'm going to make sure that this blue here, I know it's not, you can't tell it's very blue. I might add in more pigment later, but I'm gonna add in a little bit more after it's all dry. So here we go. All right, and the last step for this mouth area is the tongue. So I'm going to use my Quinacridone Magenta. Once again, I'm going to do a light layer and a combination of dropping darker color and pulling color up with a dry brush. So I'm going to put my base layer first. Keeping any highlights that I see white. Working pretty wet here. Okay, now before I add more color, I'm going to clean my brush, dry it, and pull up any color that I need to. See this part already dried. So I'm gonna re-wet it, pull up some of those tones. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I do notice that we have some lighter tones here. All right, and that's a little too intense of a line for me. Now I'm gonna go back and add some darker tones. Once again, I'm keeping it fairly wet. All right, now that part I'm gonna let dry and see what it looks like. Actually, before I do that, let me just add a little bit darker here at the tip. All right, now I'm going to let that dry and I'll see what it looks like if I need to add any shadows afterwards. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look around my painting and see if everything looks right as far as proportions. I'm noticing here that the proportions are a little bit off. I think there's a little too much of that blue area. So I'm going to actually, I think I'm going to bring the nose up a little. And I'm going to bring this down slightly.
Join me next week as we look at how to create colorful background washes. See you then.